Hello, and welcome to this webinar highlighting the results from the PISA 2018 Assessment of Financial Literacy. Andreas Schleicher, Director of the OECD Directorate for Education and Skills, will present the key findings of the assessment. After his presentation, Andreas will be joined by Florian Messi, Head of the Division on Insurance, Private Pensions, and Financial Markets at the OECD Directorate for Financial and Enterprise Affairs. Both of them will be available to answer your questions. During the webinar, please send your questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. The PowerPoint and recording of the webinar will be made available at www.oecdedutoday, all one word, .com/OECD-education-webinars. Andreas, over to you.
Thanks so much, Marilyn, and I'm really glad that I'm joined by my colleague, Florian Messi. She's actually the OECD's mastermind in the field of financial education, and has done a lot of work, not just, measuring it, as we're talking about today, but also building strategies in countries to actually help students become better of this. I think one thing we all see in this corona crisis that, yeah, it's important that we know how to solve a quadratic equation, but it may be even more important to solve very practical problems like, balancing our budgets and, doing an online transaction. And young people are confronted with those kinds of issues. And this assessment is really about how well they can do that. Let me just sort of highlight a few contextual factors. We know that the kind of security systems in many countries are shrinking. People are supposed to take more responsibility for their own lives, for their own well-being, and that requires a certain set of competencies. There's also quite clearly an increased sophistication of the financial services all around this. Again, the next generation will need to be much more savvy in navigating that space. And then financial decisions. You might think, 15-year-olds are still quite far away from this, but they do make transactions on their mobile phones. They purchase things that may have long-term implications, payment obligations. So it is important to understand those kinds of issues. And that's basically the context in which we do this assessment. And here, just a couple of key figures. When you look at the experience that 15-year-olds have that we assessed here, you can say about half of them hold a bank account. It could be a building society, post office, or credit union. We have 3/4 of students that reported that they had bought something online, 15-year-olds. So it's actually pretty much the norm now, either alone or with a family member. We have 39% of students who said that they had made a payment using a mobile phone during the last 12 months. 69% of students said they always or sometimes compare prices between a physical shop and an online shop. And half of the students, again, agreed that they enjoy talking about money matters. So you can see this world is real to young people, to the 15-year-olds of today. When you look at performance, we can say that about 15% of students really struggled. They perform below the baseline level of proficiency in financial literacy that PISA assessment establishes. For example, they have trouble recognizing the value of a simple budget. When I say simple budget, it's just, contrasting income and expenditure. We have, on the other hand of the scale, 10% of students who do remarkably well. If you look at some of the tasks they were able to solve, these were relating to complex financial products. And they could also look between the lines in text. And again, that is very, very important these days. Can we figure out the implied conditions and so on? So you have 1 in 10 students, 1 in 10 15-year-olds who were really, really good at that. If you look at the broad trends, we measured this for the first time in 2012, and then this time in 2018, things have pretty much been stable in most countries, which is actually quite disappointing if you think about it. The financial world has become, more important, more relevant for young people, more complex, and at the same time, the knowledge, skills have not really changed substantially. We saw a slump in 2015, so basically since then, you could see the last 3 years systems have caught up again, but overall, not much change in a changing world. So let's keep that in mind. Now, you look at some of the factors relating to this, and you can say, well, wealthier countries tend to have students who are better educated in general, and also students with greater financial literacy. But you can see the link between GDP per capita on the horizontal axis and financial literacy. It's actually not that clear cut. Now, you look at Estonia, or Poland, or to some extent Portugal, Latvia, the Russian Federation, Finland. And those countries have students who do better than what you would predict from the wealth of the countries. And that's true for some of these countries in general education, but for some it's actually specifically true for financial literacy. So again, or you look on the other side, you can see here the United States, Australia, Italy, Bulgaria, where performance is sort of below what you would expect given the wealth of the country. So being rich doesn't mean you're well educated, neither for individuals nor systems. You can see the same when you look at access to financial products. Again, it's not a straight line. Now you can see basically students who have a bank account or some other experience with financial products tend to do better, or systems where the students have more experience tend to do better. But again, you find interesting exceptions to this general lines. It's worth studying those patterns in greater detail, and that's exactly what this assessment is about. So let's talk about the assessment in a little bit more detail. Basically, we had 20 participating countries taking part, and we have 117,000 students across those countries sitting these tests. These were 15-year-olds. They were randomly sampled, so they're representing their countries and systems in full. I think that's very, very important. This is the world's sole representative assessment of the knowledge and skills that students have in financial literacy, and it's an important part of the PISA assessment, even though only a subset of the countries have implemented this. Now, how do we define financial literacy? We define this essentially as the knowledge and understanding of financial concepts and risks, as well as the skills, motivation, and confidence to apply such knowledge and understanding in order to make effective decisions across a range of financial contexts. So again, it's not just what you know, it's what you can do with what you know in very concrete situations. That's basically the idea, the underlying construct of this test. When you look at the test in more detail, we looked at money and transactions, we looked at planning and managing finances, risk and reward, and also some questions on the broader financial landscape. What we ask students to do is to identify financial information. You read a text, is this really about financing? To analyze information in a financial context, so the students see the financial ideas in that context, to evaluate financial issues, and then also to apply financial knowledge and understanding in real-world problems. And the problems were situated in home and family, they were situated in education and work, and they related to students themselves, but also broader social issues. That's basically what the test looked like. We also gave a questionnaire where they could report on their attitudes towards money and financial issues. And I want to talk about all of those kinds of aspects. Let's start with the most straightforward thing. This is basically the performance of people on this test. Here you can see the scale. The blue area are the countries that did really well. Yellow is sort of so-so around the OECD average, and then red is sort of below average performance. But you can see Estonia is the number one on this assessment, and they were also the number one for OECD countries on PISA in general. Finland and the Canadian provinces taking part were basically among the second and third positions. They share those places in Poland. And then if you look at the lower end of the scale, you can see some countries being spread out of this. Basically, education systems show a very wide range of financial knowledge and skills. Why do I highlight this? Because the financial products that young people encounter are actually pretty universal. So basically, in some countries, young people are quite well prepared for this financial world. In other countries, the financial world is pretty far ahead of the knowledge and skills
of young people. And you could see far from the statistics, even in some of the low performing countries, students are well exposed to the reality of the financial world. Now, you can see that in a little bit more detail. Here I show you basically performance by proficiency levels. This helps you what students can actually do. When I talk about level 1, that's basically students who identify common financial products. You know, they knew very common financial terms. They could interpret information relating to basic financial concepts, and also at a very fundamental level, recognize difference between needs and wants, and can also make simple decisions on spending decisions. Now, what I want to highlight here, you should look at some of those stuff. They were really very, very basic. In a way, when you look at that, if you ask yourself, how could a 10-year-old get any of those things wrong? But as you can see here, there's a significant share of people not being able to solve those, and actually there's a share of young people even below that level. So in many countries, we have a significant share of young people, 1 in 10, you know, 1 in 5, sometimes more than that, who have actually great difficulties in the most basic ones. Now, the baseline level, that we call it level 2, talked about already, is where students can, you know, start to apply their knowledge of common financial products and also recognize the value of, for example, simple budget, interpret prominent features of everyday financial documents, and also, you know, apply basic calculations in this. That's what we sort of call the very basic performance level. And then you get to, you know, at level 3 and 4. Then I already talked about those top performing students, students who really can deal with very sophisticated financial concepts, who can identify, you know, hidden or apply information, sort of they're really quite savvy. 1 in 10 students. So that's the distribution of knowledge and skills with each country, and you can compare that across the countries. Now, here's what we've seen in terms of changes. And in all of the figures that I'm going to show you, when I show something in darker shading, it means that it's really statistically robust. You know, you can see, for example, in Estonia, we could see real improvement. They're already doing well in 2012, but they did even better in 2018. Then in light blue, you can see countries that, you know, improved slightly, but we can't say that it's statistically significant. And then in Australia, you could see a real decline in the learning outcomes. And that's not just true for financial literacy for Australia, it's true almost across the board. So actually, relatively speaking, stability, slight improvements in a number of countries. What we can see here in this chart is that financial literacy is correlated quite robustly with performance in mathematics and reading. Where students did well in math and reading, they also tended to do well in financial literacy. But we are not quite talking about the same thing. You know, you can see, for example, here, some countries where students did, relatively speaking, better in financial literacy than they did, as you would predict from their reading and mathematics performance. That's the case in Estonia, in Finland, in Brazil, Lithuania, in Chile, the United States, Canadian provinces taking part, Australia. And then at the same time, we have other countries where students did less well in financial literacy than they did, as you would predict, from math and reading, like Italy and Serbia and Bulgaria, the Slovak Republic, Poland, Indonesia, Peru, and Georgia. So I think this is important. You know, it's not just that financial literacy is going to be an automatic byproduct of being good in math and reading, but actually there are some unique elements to this. So it suggests that, you know, the way we learn about financial literacy has something to add to how we are educated in reading and mathematics. Let's look a little bit at the disparities in performance that we can observe. I show you the difference in the performance between boys and girls. Again, these are 15-year-olds. What you can see, on average, girls do better than boys. You know, the curve for girls is a little bit higher than for boys, but you can see the boys are ahead among the top performer students, and they are dominant among the low performing students. So basically, the performance of boys is more spread out than the performance of girls.
but on average, you can see there is a slight performance advantage of girls. Not that much of a gender gap actually. That might be bigger, when you look at older sort of students. But I think here among 15-year-olds, we cannot see much of a gender gap. What is, however, significant is social gap. Now, what we can see very clearly is that students who come from more privileged neighborhoods have a significant performance advantage over students from disadvantaged neighborhoods. When you look at the score point difference on the left side, about 30, 40 points is about a school year. So you can really see that students from advantaged neighborhoods are often 1-2 school years ahead at age 15 than their students from disadvantaged backgrounds. Now that's a lot. And if you look to Peru, now we're talking about 3 school years here. And again, why is this significant? Because both privileged and disadvantaged students are exposed to very much the same financial products, the same financial realities. So if we buy something in your mobile phone, you do not understand the financial implications. I think this socioeconomic gap is something that countries should look at very, very carefully, very seriously, because again, those young people from disadvantaged backgrounds, they probably have less money, they have less protection against risk. Their parents are not going to pay their bills maybe, and they are a lot more exposed because of their low levels of skills. So I think this is a real issue that we should be looking at, a much bigger kind of gap than what we see among the genders. We can also see that in generally, students with an immigrant background are at a disadvantage. You can see that most clearly in the case of Finland. Again, we're talking about almost, 1.5 or more than 1.5 school years of the gap. Estonia as well, Portugal. Whereas in Australia, the United States, sort of immigrants tend to do a little bit better than students without an immigrant background, at least once you discount for social background. I should have said that at the beginning. What you see in the blue bar is the net kind of differences when we compare immigrants and non-immigrants from similar social backgrounds. If you want to see the raw gap, you look at the diamond. But basically, you can see a clear social gap coming out of this, with immigrant students being at a disadvantage. Now, this was about performance. You could see the average performance, the disparities. Let's talk a little bit about students' experience with money and how that actually translates into performance patterns. What you can see here is that roughly half of all students hold an account at a financial institutions or payment or debit card. And you can see actually in countries like Finland and Estonia, that seems to be the norm. You're talking about 3/4 of students, also in Canada, and you see other countries on the left side. Peru is just 1 in 10 students. So quite an important difference in the extent to which students are exposed to a payment card or debit card. And then when you look at a bank account, pictures is not that different, but you can see, for example, in Spain, it's quite common to have an account with a bank, less common to have a debit card. And then in the Russian Federation, it is more common to have a payment card, less prominent to have a bank account, but more or less same kind of picture. Basically, half of all students having some exposure to those kinds of instruments. And I think that's quite a relevant number. I'm saying this again because many people think, well, why do we bother 15-year-olds with financial literacy? But you can see that world is actually quite real for significant share of young people according to their reports. And what we can also see is that financial literacy performance is positively associated with students holding a bank account. And actually, the performance advantage is quite significant. If you're talking about 28 points, then again, it shrinks after you account for social background, immigrant background, also gender. So the net advantage is a little bit smaller, but still is 18 points. So I think that's something that is irrelevant. It's not so surprising, in a way where students have more financial experience. You would expect that they are more interested and maybe more capable in financial literacy. So, but that's exactly what this chart shows. It's not true everywhere, and it's sort of, you can see sort of a negative tendency in a few countries. That's not so clear what is behind that. But overall, I think we can say there is a link below. The causal nature of that relationship, I think that's something you cannot read out of those kinds of data. Now, 3/4 of students bought something online, and 40% of students made a payment using a mobile phone. I think that's also really quite remarkable. I mean, I must say this was the one surprise that I wouldn't have expected that so many young people actually do have, accounts that can actually use it. But look at this data; it's pretty much across the board. And again, you can see countries like Finland, Poland, Slovak Republic, United States, Latvia, Australia, Bulgaria, Lithuania, Russian Federation. It's pretty much across the board that buying something online alone or with your family is something that is very, very common across countries. And again, as you know all very well, there are lots of conditions that you sign on to when you buy something and you have to pay it sometimes. So again, you can see we are talking here well above the baseline level of financial literacy that is required to do those things well. And once again, you can see generally there's a positive link between financial literacy performance and experience with buying something online. It's not so clear for other factors, but here buying online is something where you can see the performance gap is again in the order of a school year, a little less once you net out social background. That was about the experience. Final point is students' confidence in handling money matters. What you can see here is that students in most places are actually relatively confident in handling basic digital financial transactions. So for example, you can see over 65% of students say paying with a debit card instead of using cash is something they are confident or very confident to do. Keeping track of their balance, also over 60%, and ensuring the safety of sensitive information when making an electronic payment or using online banking, 50% at least. And that sort of things get tricky. Transferring money, again, half, and then paying with a mobile device instead of using cash, also using half. So confidence levels actually pretty good. Maybe higher than actual competence. I think that's where you start to worry, but at least, when you ask students how confident they are, you can see very positive kind of figures. And also there, as you would expect, basically, where students are more confident, they also tend to do better on the test confidence. And that's something that we can see across all subject areas that we assess. Constructs like self-concept and self-efficacy tend to be good predictors of actual knowledge and skills. What's interesting here, and I don't have a clear explanation, is that that's true for some of those aspects, but less for others. Now, paying with a mobile device, being confident to do that didn't mean that actually students did really well on the test, or much less. So I think the relationship varies. I don't have a clear explanation for that, but that's something I think worth to study. We also see that students feel confident handling some more generic personal financial tasks. You can see, for example, keeping track of their account balance, planning their spending in consideration of their current financial situation, making a money transfer, understanding bank statements, filling in forms at the bank, and then understanding a sales contract. There you get below 40%. But pretty much also here, relatively good levels of confidence. And once again, in most areas, they are also a good predictor of performance. The only exception is really understanding a sales contract. We don't see any significant difference. So confidence, a good predictor of performance, but unequally so across the different areas that we have. And then, looking at financial behaviors, you can see here that about 9 in students checked how much money they have and that they are given the right change. And that was one of the more specific questions that we used to measure some of the constructs. And that's actually across the board pretty good. Let's hope that always happens in daily life. But these numbers are all above 80 or mostly above 80%, and in some countries above 90%. Most students also compare prices in different shops, including between physical and online shops. I mentioned it already at the outset.
For example, comparing prices in different shops is over 70%. Comparing prices between a shop and an online shop, a little bit less, but still good. And then wait until the product gets cheaper before buying it, still 60%. And buy the product without comparing prices, a little bit less than 40%. Interesting kind of features that, and again, we're talking about 15-year-olds on this. And again, what we can see is where students were more ready to compare prices in different shops, they tended to do better in financial literacy. Probably the correlation goes the other way around, where students are more confident, they know how important it is to compare prices. So again, the relationship, we cannot know anything about the causal nature, but we see it is positive and consistently so. Financial literacy at home, at school. You can see that 94% of students obtain information about money matters from parents on average across countries. Now, this is the longest bar. Then friends, 50%, television or radio, the internet. Now, again, that's where critical thinking, critical analysis becomes really, really important. Can young people distinguish fact from opinion? Then magazine and teachers. That's, I think, for me, it was a surprise that actually teachers are a prominent source for young people to obtain information about money matters, at least as important as many other sources. But clearly, parents at age 15, guardians, or other adults are dominant kind of source in 90%. So that's important to keep in mind, which also suggests, again, the role that schools plays. If you have parents who are well versed in those kinds of subjects, you're lucky. If you have parents who are not that strong in this, you can see if parents are the dominant source, you rely on that information. So again, I think something very important. And you can also see where parents were the primary source, students did better. That was different. That was also true for the internet, was different for the other sources of information, at least after accounting for social background. So again, I think that's something we should be looking at. What sources of information do students have? How do they validate this? And what role can school play to compensate for what comes through context and through social background? We could also see, according to their own reports, that a majority of students can discern quite independently what they spend their money on, and they are also responsible for their own money matters. Now you can see 80% of 15-year-olds saying I can decide independently what to spend my money on across the part. Still 70% I can spend small amounts of my money independently. For larger amounts, I need to ask my parents, and then I need to ask my parents or guardians for permission before I spend any money. That's actually only about 1/3 of students. Also interesting that 4 out of 5 students are responsible for their own money matters. For example, for preventing theft, according to their own reports. Again, what we can see is that these factors, many of them are positively related to performance. I can decide independently what to spend my money on is a good predictor of performance. Also, I'm responsible for my own money matters. So you can see actually, we do not know whether cause and effect go in which direction they go. But what you can see is that financial autonomy and financial competence tend to go together. So again, I think educating both will be important. That's really, I think, in a nutshell, what these results show. You could see a picture of the performance of young people. You could see a picture of how that performance varies across social groups, across genders, across countries, by proficiency level. You could see some of the student behaviors, their interests and attitudes to money. So quite rich kind of picture. And that's really, I must say, this assessment is just a tip of the iceberg of our work on financial education. There is a lot that the OECD does around all of this. For example, the OECD is supporting countries in the development of or implementation of national strategies to strengthen financial literacy. We also have a good hub, Florian can talk about this much better. We are a good hub of information and advice, basically,
We have a lot of knowledge about what different countries are doing to strengthen financial literacy. And the advice, I can't say this comes from PISA. PISA is sort of one source informing these recommendations, but from our consolidated set of data at the OECD and analysis, these are some of the things that we came up with. It is very important to address the needs of low-performing students. You could see that here, and particularly students from disadvantaged. They're exposed, to the same realities, to the same products, have less kind of security, and that is something that is important. What I take courage from is actually that some countries are doing so much better than others in eliminating low and underperformance in this area, which really shows that this is something that education systems can make a big contribution to. Provide equal opportunities for learning, boys and girls. Gender differences exist, and maybe not as strong, but they are sort of, you could see the much more dispersed distribution of performance among girls and among boys. And also, I didn't talk about this here, but we see similar kind of disparities in the attitudes of boys and girls. Now that's actually in some areas more interesting than the performance gap. It's important to support both access to and education about safe and age-appropriate financial products. Again, you look at these numbers, the large share of young people who actually are confident users of online shopping and other things. It's important to be well educated about this. And then build on students' positive experience with money. You could see the positive link between autonomy and competency. And it's something that is everybody's business, where schools and the home play together. You remember the very strong influence that parents have on the autonomy and skills of people. So that's really all I wanted to say, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks very much, Andreas. Yes, we do have some questions coming in already. First off, what financial literacy trend should we be the most worried about? And what can we anticipate for a post-COVID context?
Well, I think what the COVID context does is people, it makes you much more responsible for your own decisions. You are confronted with a more complex digital world. You are isolated from the people who might be directly around you. And I do think that landscape is not that transparent. It's difficult to manage. And that's the immediate context in which people are at this moment. Then if you think, downstream, 3-4 years, we're going to find ourselves in a much more indebted kind of context. I think the constraints which people are going to face in an economic financial crisis are going to be much, much more severe. So I think this is not a problem that young people can solve, your 15-year-olds, but I do think preparing them for a more uncertain, volatile world, I do think is more important than ever.
Do we, either Florian, you can answer this, or Andreas, whichever, do you have any information on how students' results compared with adult financial literacy in the same countries and economies?
Yeah, Florian, that's, I think, a question for you.
Yes, thank you, Andreas. Just about the question before, I think I completely agree with Andreas. The main worry now is the level of indebtedness of citizens. And of course, it's not necessarily completely relevant now for students, but it will be in the future. We are living in an uncertain world, and we want to make sure they are prepared. Current citizens are not very well prepared. And the possibility of one, being over-indebted. Second, as you know, in many countries, there is now a possibility to tap into your pension benefits. It is the case with some ceiling in Australia. If citizens do not understand the long-term consequences of, taking some benefit now, the outcome will be, less retirement income in the future. Now, to this particular question, Marilyn, sorry, I got carried away. Can you repeat that just quickly?
The adults compare basically. Skilled of young people and adults compare.
So if I don't look at countries, but if I just look, at for example, gender, it is much clearer that there is a gender gap differences if we look at the adult population as compared to the student population. As Andreas mentioned, there is not much of a gender gap with students, perhaps gender differences, I would say. For the adult population, there is really a difference in financial knowledge and confidence of women when it comes to financial matters. Now, if we look at countries, I would say that the picture is relatively consistent. If you look at the US, if you look at Italy, which is not performing so well in the PISA financial literacy exercise, it's the same if you look at the adult population. And by the way, we will release some results for adults at the end of June, so you'll be able to see for yourself. But it is relatively consistent, although the two exercises are really quite different. PISA is really looking at applied knowledge. Our results for adults are really looking at partly knowledge, but about attitudes and behavior. But again, consistency there.
Yeah, if I may add one point to this, I mean, people, when they see very little gender difference in the young population, bigger gap in the older population, we need to be really cautious, I think, ensuring that there's a great risk in many of our societies that early gaps tend to get reinforced as people get older. You know, you get into the kind of jobs where your skills are better used and so on. So let's not say because among 15-year-olds there is no gender gap, when these people become older, the problem has gone away. No, I think we will continue to see gender inequality on those dimensions.
Yes, and if I may just reinforce that, it is true that if we look at the financial literacy proficiency in PISA, there is little difference, but there are differences in terms of attitude, in terms of behavior relative to spending, in terms of activities online. Boys tend to be more active online, more confident. So we already see some gender differences, even though the financial literacy proficiency per se are not that different.
Thank you both very much. I'm going to ask two questions together since they're kind of related and they're both somewhat technical. Did the methodology change from previous PISA reports, assessments? And what were the measures of financial literacy in PISA? Were there also aspects of financial literacy that were more problematic than others for students?
Well, actually, the methodology is consistent in the sense that we can measure trends, but mainly, and we gave a little bit more, focus on the digital aspects, also the assessment was delivered in a digital context. I think those are changes, but overall, I think the assessment itself is quite consistent. Where we made more changes, actually, the context information, like to ensure that the environment in which young people find themselves.
Thank you. I can react to that. So yeah, Andreas is completely right. Of course, the assessment and the principle of the assessment has not changed much, although we have created new items for the 2018 assessment, especially looking at digital transaction and making sure that the items or the question we're putting students in a real life context. And we also had a number of new questions in the questionnaire. Also, just to say that in 2018 and 2012, the sample templates or modeling was the same, whereas in 2015 it was slightly different. Mainly, I can take the next question and then give the floor back to Andreas. I understand the question to be what is most problematic in terms of financial literacy for students. From what we can see, we're just looking at our proficiency scales and looking at, at the last of the proficiency levels, which is proficiency level number 5. The most problematic for students, it seems, is to understand the implication of a financial decision made today, because all of the problems that involve a kind of longer term view on what's next in terms of the consequences of the decision today is problematic. And this is the essence of most financial decision. If you're taking a credit now, it means you have to repay for a number of years. If you are not saving now for your retirement, you won't have, or you have little retirement income when you reach retirement age.
Okay, thank you both. Another question pertaining to migration. How does the type of migration, whether it's skilled migration or humanitarian migration, influence financial literacy performance, if it does at all?
Yeah, you could see actually it's not clear cut. It varies across countries. In most countries, students with an immigrant background, we cannot really distinguish in this data what type of immigration we're dealing with. We just know whether students were outside the country or the parents, sort of whether they were first or second generation immigrants. In countries, there's a significant performance drag. You can see actually those students are at a quite important disadvantage even after discounting for social background. So this is really something that isn't just that immigrants tend to be poorer, but even once you take it into account, and these could be issues around language and other factors. There are a couple of countries where this is not so clear, or where actually immigrants are at a slight advantage. Remember the figures from Australia and the United States. So it varies across countries, but on balance, immigrant students are at a disadvantage in this comparison.
Nothing to add. I think Andreas was comprehensive on this one.
Okay, thank you. Another question, given the clear role of parents in educating their children, how do you see the role of schools in empowering disadvantaged families to help their children or to support their children better?
Yeah, I think you could see that parents are the dominant factor, dominant source of information, but don't discount the prominence of teachers. Now, if you think about, 50% of students on average across countries taking information from their teachers. The teachers actually do have an important role, and in a way you could look at this the other way around. The more dominant the role of parents is, the more you wish that schools actually take a compensatory approach. It could be directly related to what is going on in school by integrating more financial context in the instructional environment, in math and in social science and so on. There are plenty of opportunities for doing this directly, but it could also be indirectly, but by working with parents and education and society in more general terms. So I think that we should not discount the role of schools. I actually would look at this the other way around. I think the most surprising finding from the survey is not that students take advice at age 15 from the parents, but how important the role of teachers is as a sole source of information.
Yes, if I can add to what Andreas was saying, I completely agree with what he said. I think what we are seeing is just that financial literacy is not really introduced fully into the school. So obviously, students are taking their information on money matters from their parents because the available information in school is not a lot, or it's in optional courses, or it's as an option. So I think this is what the data is telling us currently, and looking at the fact that disadvantaged students tend to perform not as well as advantaged students. Of course, school, we do believe, have a role to play in providing equity in the system. Of course, the question is how, understanding that the curriculum are overcrowded, but certainly there is a big role to be played by schools. I'd like to add that for now, parents are playing a big role, so it is very important to support parents and families, and I know that a number of countries are currently doing so. We are only in lockdown, so they are providing tutorial and training for parents to start speaking about money matters to their children.
And a kind of related question, what would be the role of finance companies such as banks and insurance companies in teaching financial education, both to students and to parents for that matter?
Andreas, do you? Yes, of course. So banks, insurance companies, financial institutions, some of them have initiatives trying to support the financial literacy of their clients in some cases. Some are in the schools as well. What the data is telling us about action in the schools of banks, insurance institutions, is that it is not really helping this much in terms of the financial literacy of students. Plus there is a potential conflict of interest, I would say. So I wouldn't necessarily push that. I think really the role of banks and insurance company and financial institution in general is really to provide good advice to their clients in terms of their financial decision, not necessarily to provide them with financial literacy, because there is, again, a good chance of conflict of interest there. At the same time, it doesn't mean that the private sector has no role to play. We see that in many countries, the private sector, by which I mean, financial institution, association of financial institutions are playing a role, but it is better that it is done at the association level rather than at the company level. Although some programs, especially out of school for some banks, are relatively useful.
Thank you, Florane. A question from Nepal. This study, as this person comments, is basically carried out in advanced countries. Do you think that the findings of the study would be relevant to developing countries, such as Nepal?
Well, I think it's actually a broad mix of countries. You could see results from Peru, from Indonesia in this survey. So I do think we can extrapolate to some extent, but I think if Nepal would be interested to take part in the next session, we would welcome them. And but it's always hard to sort of see to what extent results can be extrapolated and generalized. But I do think that many countries have many large shares of low-performing students in this area. So I do think that we can learn important lessons from this.
And in a related question, could you give some suggestions on how to tackle the lack of this kind of education, mainly in developing countries? What grade level should this begin at?
Yeah, I don't think it's wise to think about, introducing a subject financial literacy necessarily early on, but I think teachers could do a lot from the earliest years actually to make learning more relevant using financial context, and we often teach mathematics in very abstract ways, and students get bored and get put off actually, and then don't follow this anymore. They don't relate it to their current and real lives. I think, mathematics, even in primary school, can be taught in a way that we use contexts from the real world, including financial literacy. In, social sciences, social fields, we can actually look at some of the, broader concepts that we talked about here. I think school offers actually many opportunities to sort of think about, help students think about, how they can use what they learn in school in their real world. So I don't think there's a shortage of real contexts in here. And I just think it's also not, about a financial literacy teacher. I do think it's about almost any teacher who could do something to strengthen those kinds of competencies. And again, I think from the earliest years on, I think it's really about relevance. It's about making learning more interesting, more geared towards the situations in which young people find themselves. And I think that is not only going to benefit financial competences, but education more generally.
If I can add to Andreas, well, you shouldn't forget that when we speak about financial literacy, we don't only speak about money matters, we also speak about attitude. And for example, delayed gratification is a very important component of how you behave in your future life and in terms of making financial decisions. Whether I buy today with not the money that I need to buy, for example, that TV, or whether I wait until I have the saving and can actually buy the TV. So all this kind of attitude can be ingrained very early in life, ideally, within the family context. But if this is not happening, schools can have a role to play here. And I agree that it doesn't need to be in the math class, it can be in any class, and it doesn't need to be a financial literacy teacher at all. It can be any teacher that is able to convey this kind of sound habits and savvy habits in terms of not only money, as I said, but really about attitude to life.
Are there any specific good practices that you've observed that you would suggest or recommend?
Florane, you want to talk about your work on financial education a bit?
Yes. Of course. Well, good practices is a very large term, so I'm not sure what we're speaking about. But if just we are looking only as students, because I guess the question is related to young people, I would say that we see a number of good practices in countries in terms of trying to integrate financial literacy as cross-curricular subject rather than as a separate subject. Quite often separate subject is simply not possible because of the curriculum. Second, what we see that is working quite well is rather than introducing that topic, straightforward into the curriculum, trying to pilot first, the resources, train the teachers. So this has worked quite well in countries that even had, difficulties with other areas of competency. I always think that, for example, countries like Australia are doing that quite well with a very sound training of teachers for a very long time. And I think that's, producing effect. Also using, and now it's becoming even more important, of course, digital delivery. So digital delivery of financial literacy is becoming common in schools, but also for adults. And I think is the future, of course.
Thank you, Florane. Another question, in this research, did you decide to estimate the possible difference of influence between public and private schools?
We do have that data. I don't think we have covered that in this publication. I have not seen it myself. But
no,
we
it
can
is
provide
not
that information.
Not in the publication, but we do have the information.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Also, one of
what I can say on this is that, generally speaking, we do not see much of a performance differences between public and private schools once you net out the social context of schools. So, and I would expect the pattern to be quite similar, but we can check that.
Thank you. One of our participants would like a little bit of clarification. She says that it sounds like the gender gap in adults is that men have greater financial literacy, whereas amongst young people, it's women who have, or the young girls who have greater financial literacy. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Not exactly. I don't think that in young age women have greater financial literacy. I don't see that happening for girls, although it depends on countries. And also by financial literacy for adults, we really mean knowledge. And here the gap is really on understanding of key concept and also a lack of confidence for adult women, or I should say simply women.
Yeah, but I think what is true is that you look at the PISA results and you can see basically girls at an overall advantage. You look at the results of older people. That's true for literacy in general. You can see men at an advantage. And to some extent, that may be a cohort effect. So it may wash out over time, but it's also a matter of workplace practices, having kind of jobs and activities that engage those kinds of competencies. So I do think we need to look at both the cohort and the time effect here.
Another question on a very different subject. How might we begin to deliver financial literacy to young people in countries where gambling is becoming a concern?
It's a good question, but to me, I think the answer is in those contexts, you probably will even need more of that. I think the understanding of risks and rewards, and those are concepts that are actually quite at the heart of financial literacy. I do think in a country where you have a context that is conducive to those kinds of activities, you better prepare young people for it. But I don't have much to offer on the how question here.
Yes, well, it is an interesting question, although a difficult one, and one that we are addressing quite a lot, not necessarily this one in particular, but it's the question of how do you improve financial literacy or actually well-being in countries where the culture is for the now, or where there is no risk aversion, because this is the issue with gambling. And here, well, you have to work with what you have and with the attitude and habit in the country. So it is quite important to try and understand the reason behind this gambling. Is it's just the absence of risk aversion or something else that is happening, or appetite for for investment, or just understanding that gambling is an investment. So it is important to understand the context. So without context, it's difficult to understand completely in a straightforward way. But what I would say is, with any kind of policies, you need to understand your audience, and here typically understand this attitude.
I think we have time for just one last question. The question is, do you think that the COVID-19 crisis is going to affect in any way the next assessment, and if so, how?
On the next PISA assessment, actually, the PISA governing board is currently working on this to see to what extent the physical delivery of the PISA assessment is feasible. I think that's an open question in schools working under confinement conditions. But there's a more interesting question, how it will have affected the attitudes and expectations of young people towards education. And in fact, one of the things that PISA will do is to introduce a special module in the assessment to actually survey students on this. And to what extent has remote learning, online learning changed their practice? How is their relationship with teachers evolved during this period? And so there are many interesting aspects beyond the simple administration of the test that we should understand better, and that's what the next PISA assessment will do.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Florian and Andreas, and many thanks to our participants for your interest in the OECD's work on education and financial literacy. We invite you to join the PISA website, www.oecd.org/PISA, where you'll find the report, Are Students Smart About Money?, which is the 4th volume of the PISA 2018 results publication. You'll also find current and archived issues of PISA in Focus, data visualizations, and videos all about PISA. So thank you very much again for joining us. See you next time.